Here we are again. Welcome back to everyone. Let's start the first panel of the Pegaso International Conference on Sustainability Challenges in the Relationship between Africa and Europe, together tomorrow, today. The moderator is the Director General of the Multiversity Holding and the Administrative Director of Pegaso International, Dr. Andrea Buonomo. Please, Director, the floor is yours.
Good evening, all participants, and again, after my welcome greetings, it's an honor to being the moderator of this first panel of the PI conference. The objective of this panel is to discuss the challenge that African and European society are facing in light of the current political and economic and demographic environment, and share together what are possible opportunities to find a common future and improve the cooperation and therefore this mixed societies in order to face the challenge of the future. In this panel, we will emphasize. In this panel, we will emphasize, the strategic role of dialogue and technology also to engage determinant peoples and policymakers from both geographical area or geographical region of this part of the world, and in order to have a more inclusive and sustainable growth or joint growth of these two important geographic regions. We will pose different questions during this panel. First of all, what future we imagine for Africa and Europe, considering this our times that are very challenging and in somehow confused. In order to understand what are the key opportunities that these two societies can tap together and build synergies in a very jointly approach, co-constructing and a new world to survive. In this complex environment, and more importantly, just to be concrete, we will also try to understand what policymakers can do and how we can help in creating and leveraging the dialogue and technology for more sustainable development. To start this panel, I would like to introduce you our keynote speakers. Karim Moustaghfir, sorry for the spelling. Karim is the AVP for the 21st Century Learning Innovation Faculty Development at the University of Morocco, Akhawayn. Karim is also Associate Professor and Project Coordinator of Human Resource Development in his university, and both his academic experience and research has always been between these two geographic areas, and he has a deep knowledge of both African and European society. So please, Karim, if you want to start your speech and and enlighten us on what could be, the future of Africa and Europe, and what could be the future environment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrea Buonomo. I seize this opportunity to extend my special thanks to you and to Professor Luigi Melillo for this invitation to share some thoughts regarding particularly the sustainability challenges involving both Africa and Europe, and also for offering us this great opportunity and this interesting platform for dialogue, discussion, and also knowledge sharing. So to start this presentation, I guess that you see my screen, right? Okay, perfect.
Yes, thank you, Karim. We see this.
Yeah, thank you so much. So first of all, I would like also to start with some demographic data. So as you can see, it is expected by 2050 that Africa would represent a quarter of the world population. And here it was mentioned by Professor El-Zoheiry earlier that today we have reached something like 1.3 billion as African people. And this number is expected also to increase to reach something like 2.4 billion by 2050. And 50% of this population is expected also to have an age under 25. So I think that this is really something that we should also consider when discussing potential policies of cooperation between Europe and Africa, and I will come back closer to this. So definitely, when we talk about African population and particularly the Africa representing the youngest continent in the world, Africa today is also home to 4 times as many children as Europe. At the same time, the birth rates in Europe are somehow stagnating. In 2020, so this rate didn't exceed 10.4 per 1,000 people in Europe. So at the same time, the European population is aging, and the European Union's countries are witnessing clear shortages in qualified labor. So here, again, I'm not presenting these figures to state that there are divergent trends. However, I consider particularly such evolutionary patterns as potential complementarities between Europe and Africa. And here, when we talk about youth in Africa, we consider that as a potential asset, and how Europe and European countries could leverage on that potential, particularly to meet 21st century requirements and expectations when it comes to the job market growth and sustainability. In terms of trade, another figure, and I think that this is really important also to stress at this stage, the European Union and its member states consider the most important trading partnership for Africa. So amounting for something like 288 billion euros. At the same time, African countries are also considered as important destinations for EU exports. And the EU remains the biggest export market for agriculture and food products from Africa, something estimated around 17.6% for, let's say, the European countries, and 16.5% for African countries. However, as I already anticipated it, Africa is facing many challenges: poverty, hunger, and undernourished people. For instance, just to give you also some figures here, 300 300 million people in Africa are still suffering from hunger. And 34% of African households are living with something less than $1.9 a day. So this is something also to consider. In terms of healthcare, education, and employment, also this is quite challenging for a number of African countries. If you can take the example just of what happened with COVID, whereas we find a vaccination rate in Europe that has exceeded 73%, that rate didn't reach even 15% in Africa. I would also mention the need rate. By need, as you know, we are referring particularly to that population that is not in education, not employed, and not in training. And here, in some African countries, this rate of the need may reach even 40%. 40%. All of this is because of social political conflicts, climate variability and extremes, economic slowdowns and downturns, and high levels of inequalities. Adding to that, obviously, the human smuggling and illegal migration. In terms of digital technological development, since you mentioned this as one of the major venues for development and particularly cooperation between Europe and Africa, in terms of digital technological developments, here we estimate that the contribution of African countries to global exports when it comes to digital services doesn't even exceed 1%. 1%. And obviously, there are phenomena that are penalizing dramatically the growth and the sustainable growth of African countries. So here I'm referring to illicit financial flows and tax evasion by companies, amounting something like $89 billion, which represents something like 3.7% of the continent's GDP. And obviously, the lack of infrastructure, transport, and connectivity. Just to give you also another figure here. So it's estimated that 53% of roads in Africa are unpaved and are completely isolated from the trade hubs. So this is just to give you a picture about the context in the African, let's say, environment. Obviously, we very much appreciate what has been done and what is done at the European level, at the African level, particularly to build a strong, sustainable partnership. And here, obviously, as you can see on this slide, there are some initiatives or platforms also for dialogue and also for knowledge sharing and for cooperation, particularly to make both continents coexisting in peace, security, democracy, prosperity, solidarity, and human dignity. And obviously with all the summits, the fora, and I would mention also the Africa-Europe Foundation. In 2022, we had the summit of the European Union and the African Union. And here there was a joint vision for 2030 that emphasized particularly the centrality of the Sustainable Development Goals. And there is actually an agreement to allocate something like 150 billion euros over a period of 6 years, particularly to foster such kind, let's say, of cooperation, particularly when it comes to investments, to productive investments. And obviously, we target by such kind of investments mainly trade, development, security, and good governance. And I very much appreciate particularly to see that one approach that has been adopted by Europe, particularly to build such cooperation with Africa, is mainly based on Team Europe, means that we will be particularly building on synergies and also on cohesiveness and making sure that we try to build on a community-oriented or community-based, let's say, kind of cooperation. So just quickly, because I know that there are time constraints, So obviously, such a partnership is focusing on green transition and energy access, as it was already mentioned in the first inaugural panel. Digital transformation, sustainability, growth and jobs, peace, security and governance, and obviously migration and mobility. So this is more, let's say, broad as a perspective, just to give you an idea about the actions that are involved in such kind of partnership. So the Global Gateway Investment Package, emphasizing green transition, the digital transition, the growth and jobs, and human development. As you could see, so we see much emphasis being placed also on science, technology, and innovation, besides obviously vital sectors like health and education. There are at least a couple of examples that would illustrate how such kind, let's say, of partnership could be really productive and make sure that it's really focused on producing specific results that will help African countries grow. So I'm just mentioning here a couple of initiatives, including the digital transformation strategy for Africa and also the Nature Africa initiative. In terms of education, science, and technology, as I've just mentioned it, here, besides all the human capital development initiatives, including Erasmus Plus and other actions, we see that there is a clear projection also to support African countries when it comes to science for policy. And also a clear, let's say, projection to help African countries get access to also open source and open science sources and resources. The gender dimension that is clearly emphasized also when it comes to research and innovation. And last but not least, this idea also to promote centers of excellence. So the main orientations, if we can say, for higher education at this level is to make sure that we are trying also to get Africa and African countries as part of the evolving knowledge-based economy. So instead of being left behind. And we want to do it mainly through innovation and entrepreneurship. And to do that, there is also a clear orientation to help African countries reform their education systems and make sure that it delivers particularly those skills and those competencies that are required by the 21st century job market. Clearly, we need also to mention that there is a clear interest for specific innovative fields like digital economy and inclusive education, but at the same time, the agenda includes also smart, green, comprehensive, inclusive, and value-driven actions and programs. Just to provide my own perspective with regards also to such kind, let's say, of a joint vision 2030. I believe that here we have a nice framework, but it's still, let's say, an upper level framework. Means that in order to get also concrete results, particularly when I talked about the projections in terms of world population and what we expect by 2050, which is tomorrow. So we feel that there is really sense of urgency. So it's good also to have long-term plans, but at the same time, I think that we need to opt for bottom-up approaches that are then scalable. And here, the idea is particularly to think seriously about Africa, Europe, higher education, research and innovation space or spaces. At some point at the European Parliament level, we are talking about corridors for specific, let's say, sectors, for specific actions and for specific projects. So here, maybe we need also to opt for such kind, let's say, of perspective that would help us at the granular level, to build digital networks for two things, for learning, and second is for providing what we call smart workplaces, which has the potential to counter, let's say, act the illegal migration, the brain drain, and facilitate more, let's say, virtual brain circulation between Africa and Europe. And obviously, such spaces should emphasize not only the North-South cooperation, but also South-North and South-South. There is also a clear need to get support, again, at the university, at the school levels, to help develop a system of education that emphasizes the importance of 21st century skills. And here I'm referring also to reforming curricula to make sure that we are making appropriate use of pedagogical innovation, that we are experimenting also with micro-credentials. And this is the future, by the way, of education and higher education. The market is expecting specific skills and specific competencies, not degrees. And I think that this is the wave that has been affecting the job market and should be somehow incorporated also in our vision, in our programs. Student success and employability, mainly to make sure that we are developing graduates who are hitting the ground running. So with that kind of confidence, with that kind, let's say, of mindset to engage in, let's say, in entrepreneurial attitudes and also entrepreneurial behaviors. And here, the idea is to make sure that each graduate would become the chief executive officer of one's own career and also life. And obviously, we need to care about quality, make sure that we have, I'm not saying common systems, but at least shared systems when it comes to accreditations, degree recognition, and monitoring systems to facilitate mobility, to facilitate also the integration of workforce into the job market, but at the same time also to measure the effectiveness of the programs that we are implementing. For instance, here I'm mentioning just the experience of Erasmus Plus with all the mobility programs and how we could really assess from a tangible but also intangible perspectives the impact of such programs on people well-being and also on sustainable development. And last but not least, capacity, helping Africa to build capacity for impactful research. So the idea is not just to support knowledge transfer, but to overcome this logic of knowledge transfer to make sure that we are working together to build that capacity for impactful research that considers the African realities and also the specific needs of African societies. And just to conclude, I have here three main success factors that for me can really represent the cornerstone, right, or a major cornerstones, if we cannot talk about a backbone here for such kind, let's say, of cooperation that we try to build between Africa and Europe, focusing on sustainable development. So first of all, we need also to take the partnership beyond the traditional donor-recipient relationship. I think that this is really fundamental. So from a cultural perspective, also, this could help us overcome a number actually of prejudices, stereotypes, and engage really in more inclusive dialogue and also knowledge sharing and science-driven cooperation. Engaging in renewed, mutually beneficial, sustainable partnership based on solidarity and cooperation in the real sense of cooperation. And last but not least, a new partnership of equals. And as you mentioned it, Dr. Buonomo, I believe in adopting a logic of co-construction. So for me, that's really what I want also to share with you at this stage. And obviously, if there are any questions at this stage, or maybe we can leave that at the end. So thank you very much again for the opportunity, and feel free also to share your own perspectives and also to share any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karim, for this very inspirational view of this environment. And please, I ask to all the participants of the panel if they have any questions for Karim or general questions overall. Okay, so let's move on. And just to continue, and in order to envision what could be the future of African Europe in these times, I will give the floor to Marie-Louise Coleiro Preca, Emeritus President of Malta, that given the deep knowledge as of these two parts of the world, as a leading politician and policymakers, I would like to introduce her and give the floor to President Preca.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrea. But before I start, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Karim for this beautiful presentation of the real facts. I'm really on the same page as you, and to be honest, I feel I'm not going to add much value to what you have said, undoubtedly, because I'm truly I identify exactly on all the points that you have been speaking about. So good afternoon once again to everybody, to colleagues and friends. In my welcome contribution earlier, I stressed the importance of education and training as a prerequisite to the holistic well-being of all peoples, including the peoples of our neighboring African continent. To put my contribution into context, but Dr. Karim has done this in such an able way, I would like to highlight some bleak statistical facts that unfortunately Africa is facing presently. Around 1/3 of the 420 million young people of Africa are out of work. In Africa, between 10 million and 12 million people reach working age, but only around 3 million jobs are created each year. Territorial conflicts and state disintegration on the continent are adding to further instability that obviously prohibits interest for investment. Peace and stability are fundamental to development and progress. Education and training are fundamental to the creation of sustainable employment opportunities for all. For young people in particular, skills gaps between education and the needs of the labor market can be detrimental to sustainable employment. The creation of jobs must involve a combined effort from all stakeholders, including government, private sector, civil society organizations, and grassroots community involvement. When speaking of the creation of jobs, we are speaking of honest and sustainable investment. Such investment is to be attractive by ensuring that governments create and enable the right economic environment for the private sector to prosper. Underlying all this is the need for education and training of the highest level. We need to share our know-how, our expertise, our experience in education. We need to reach out to those countries that have already the appetite to educate and to empower their young generation for a good standard of living and for their own growth. The continent of Africa can thrive and can grow and will grow. Africa does not need charity, but justice and honest sharing. There are ways of how we can share in education. And therefore, let's work to show that multilateralism in education has not failed as the political multilateralism, unfortunately. Let's prove our beliefs in the fundamental right to education. Let's ensure that all children enjoy their human right to learn. I therefore would like to put forward a few proposals for your deliberation for the way forward and of how we can support, in particular, Europe. And this is to add to Dr. Karim's recommendations, suggestions, and aspirations. And for example, mentoring and or training programs whereby diverse stakeholders open new doors for young people in Africa. The possibility for promoting mobility of students, researchers, and entrepreneurs between Africa and Europe. We need to improve the legal framework for conditions of entry and residence in the EU applicable to third country nationals for the purpose of research, studies, and student exchange. We need to use annual call for scholarships and relevant national programs of the European Union, member states, and associate countries to support mobility of students and university staff between Europe and Africa partner countries. We need to work towards mutual recognition of academic qualifications and professional certificates through the conclusion of bilateral agreements or by other means. We need to promote migration schemes in small and medium enterprises, including training programs for African entrepreneurs in European countries, including through circular migration. Europe owes this to the African continent. Let's put the history of colonization to rest and reach out tangibly, honestly, and sustainably towards the peoples of Africa. I believe that the African continent is so rich in those things that truly matter. Vibrant colors, profound and passionate music that touches the heart, beautiful art, and the most magnificent natural landscapes and environment, and above all else, its peoples. Attending this conference today, there is a rich diversity of learned academics from universities from the northern shores of Africa. There is no better place to promote the need of education and training at all levels if we sincerely want to bring about sustainable change. The need for education is also highlighted in the sustainable goal number 4, which requires that we, and I quote, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. I believe the international community must put in more effort to prioritize equitable access to quality education for all. We need to work together, no matter our role, no matter from where we come from. We need to help build a more prosperous, more peaceful, and more sustainable future for all the young people of Europe and Africa. Europe and Africa are twin continents. Africa should matter to Europe in a different way. Europe needs Africa and its peoples. Finally, I believe that the very first and foremost investment that is needed for the peoples of Africa is an investment in their dignity through education, training, and life empowerment. I would like to close my brief contribution with the inspiring words of Nelson Mandela, who said, and I quote, "Education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world." Thank you.
Thank you very much, President, for this speech. And now I think we unfortunately do not we cannot connect with Professor Totoli, since he's in Indonesia with significant troubles with connection and cannot be part to this panel. But we can continue with President Hamid El-Zoheiry, President of Euro-Mediterranean University in Slovenia, but also former Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research, senior policy advisor of the Minister and Executive Director of the Research and Development, and of course, I covered many other important role as advisor and supporter to the policymaker to envision and ensure the sustainable development in Europe and Africa. So with a great pleasure, I will give the floor to President El-Zoheiry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buonomo. And again, I would like to thank Pegaso International for holding this important event. Thank you personally, and of course, thank Professor Melilo for her efforts in organizing this annual conference. I also add my voice to President Preca in commending the keynote speech that Professor Karim Moustaghfir has given. It really was very comprehensive with some very useful food for thought. I just want to start by saying one thing. As you have presented me, I worked at the Egyptian Ministry of Higher Education and Research for some time, and I had the privilege and honor of chairing the African Ministerial Council on Science and Technology, which was a council that follows up on the ministerial decisions taking from 2010 to 2012. I also at that time worked as the co-chair of the EU-Africa High-Level Policy Dialogue. And I have to say, and this is, of course, you all know that Africa, yes, it's full of resources, it's full of unexploited potential, but until very recently, this potential was on its way to be actually achieved. And I would like to give you some figures. I think my dear friend Karim gave you also a very good resume of the challenges facing Africa. But I would like to now look at the other side, the opportunities. I mean, I don't disagree with him. There are a lot of challenges in Africa, but there are also a lot of opportunities. So until 2018, Africa has been recorded a very fast growth. So 6 of the 10 fastest growing countries in the world were from Africa. And 30 African countries were at that time considered middle income or higher income even countries. So you can imagine from 55 countries now, 30 countries were considered middle income. So when we look at Africa, we tend to oversee this achievement that was done in Africa. And Africa has a very clear vision. It has the Agenda 2063. So Africa has even an agenda that goes beyond the EU's agenda until 2063, which, by the way, should be always looked at when we are developing programs with Africa. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 came and Africa was hit. Karim has explained this very well, also was hit hard because the rate of vaccination is much less. And of course, Africa depends on a large extent to trading with the world. There was problems with supply chain, and over and above, tourism has stopped. Europe and the rest of the world looked inwards instead of looking outwards. So Africa was very hardly hit. And as if this is not enough, and to, like they say, to add salt to the wounds, then the war in Ukraine happened. And with the rise in the prices and the food insecurity of food and energy, and just to give you an example, countries in Africa, and not only in sub-Saharan Africa, Egypt, for example, depends, some figures say 70, some figures say 80% of its wheat comes from these 2 countries. So you can imagine, of course, the effect of the rising price of wheat. But not only Egypt, actually, many other African countries, I think 13 African countries depend more or less on 50% of their wheat also from Russia and the Ukraine. So the food crisis, the energy crisis, and of course, adding to this that Africa has been lately suffering from climate change and extreme drought. These are all added factors to a crisis that's forming in Africa. But having said that, there's a lot of opportunities. Any crisis also offers opportunities. Again, like Dr. Karim has said, this youth bulge, what I call the youth bulge, with the very young and vibrant youth in Africa, this complements the aging societies in Europe, and this is somehow should be looked at as a resource. One resource that we have to always look at also, that Africa is full of raw materials, and until recently, let's say, and post-colonial heritage maybe, Africa was expected to just export its raw material. But we have to help Africa develop its raw material and complete the value chain, and not only export something to Europe that then Europe makes value of, but rather complete the value chain and help Africa develop its own products. And this is, of course, with technological advancements and digital transformation and other areas. One area that is also very important, and I think it's sometimes overlooked, and I'm addressing actually the moderator's question about the key opportunity, is the structural transformation. The difficulties between the cooperating system and the partnering systems between the EU and Africa lies in the incompatibility of the cooperating systems, meaning that Europe is very structured, whereas Europe has its commissions, its hierarchy, its very strong structure. Africa and the Mediterranean as well, I have to say, southern Mediterranean countries are not as structured. So the cooperation and partnership between these incompatible systems poses a lot of issues in the cooperation itself, might hinder the cooperation. So what the EU should be helping Africa with is to prioritize this structural transformation, and particularly a green transformation, which is inclusive and resilient and will ensure that no one is left behind. This is one of the priority areas that I think should be addressed. Another area, and maybe I will stop after this, because I would like to also leave if there are some discussions at the end. One area, and again addressing the moderator's questions, which is what can we advise the policymakers on? What can we ask the policymakers to do? Of course, human resource development is very important, entrepreneurship, education and entrepreneurship for that, so that the young people in Africa can find jobs, can find meaningful jobs, because we have unemployment and we have also underemployment, where you find doctors and engineers working as taxi drivers, for instance. And this happens in Africa. So apart from this, I think policymakers have to really consider one thing, and maybe this is not only policymakers, but also the European societies when they are dealing with Africa. There is a rift that has recently grown. And this rift comes from the idea of Europe. Of course, I think that everyone, probably, if you ask anyone, maybe not in Russia, anyone will agree that the war is that's happening now in Ukraine is very unfair, and that we should all oppose it. But the problem is countries in Africa are dependent in food and military supplies, and sometimes to a large extent economic welfare on Russia and China. So what I mean is the interest of the big powers in Africa, like Russia and China, is immense. And Europe and the US are not the only players there. Actually, they are the latecomers to this, if you want to ask me, to the cooperation, because the interest of Europe in Africa started really significantly in 2000 with the first summit, which happened in Cairo in 2000, and there this strategy and partnership started. But China has had interest in Africa well before that. So Africa is put in a position where it has to take sides between these big players, and this, in my opinion, is a big mistake. So some understanding from the policymakers and politicians, not to corner Africa and African countries and African regimes and have them to make the choice, because they are not strong enough to make this choice. They cannot really impose sanctions on Russia and stand firmly behind the sanctions like Europe can do. So this is my advice to policymakers, that they have to always consider that Africa, not put African nations under this pressure of making hard choices, because I don't think that these choices will be compatible with the partnership in the future. I hope I've addressed some of your comments, and I look forward to the discussion later on. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this great food for thought. And but now I think that we have to also move on. I mean, after this first set of speech, what I think is important to do for this panel is start to address what would be the opportunities in cooperation of Africa among African countries and between Africa and Europe in order to create synergies leveraging technology and dialogue. For this, it's my pleasure, to introduce Joseph Shevel, the president of Galilee International Magic Institute in Israel, member of the Prime Minister Committee of Social Policy, member of the Environmental Committee of Haifa region, and director and coordinator of several European Mediterranean network in the field of management and economic development. So with great pleasure, I give the floor to President Joseph Shevel.
Hello, Shalom from Galilee Institute in Israel. I'm very glad to be here and to speak about our experience with Africa and what we think we all have to do with Africa in order to help Africa, and in fact, if you wish, to help ourselves. First, I want to emphasize climate change. Climate change is all over, but I think it's much more significant in Africa. First and foremost is the desert. The desert, the Sahara. Think about this belt. Sahara is moving south. Is moving south, so we have more and more dry land. And for example, north of Ghana, that used to be green, it's becoming dry. Dry, and of course, all the farmers that used to be in the north, they are moving south. They are moving south, so those farmers in the south don't like it. They start fighting, they start shooting. The same thing in North Nigeria. And also in East Africa, the same thing. And maybe the main problem is water. There is no water in Africa. The amount of water is going down very rapidly. Just to give you one example, Chad, there is a country, Chad. There was a lake. The size of the lake was 20,000 square kilometers. By the way, the size of Israel. 20,000 square kilometers of water, fresh water. This was in the 70s and 80s. Now it is totally dry. Dry! In the middle of the Sahara. Can you imagine? Also Lake Victoria, that is in Kenya and Uganda, is shrinking because around Lake Victoria there are 30 million people living there, drinking the water, fishing fish, and they shrink. Now, please remember, the Lake Victoria is the source of the Nile, the White Nile that goes to Sudan and Egypt. Can you imagine Egypt? with more than 100 million people, suddenly the Nile is going down, less and less water. Now, and on top of everything is deforestation. So in Africa, Africa used to be covered by forests. No more forests. No more forests. More and more they cut trees. In Ethiopia, that used to be covered with forest, now only 3%. 3% is covered by forest. Kenya, 6%. Can you imagine? And of course, it affects climate change. Now the question is, what is the solution? And here in Israel, we already reuse 90% of our water. 90%. You flush the toilet, the water goes, we purify and we water agriculture. In fact, the water is safe to drink, but nobody wants to drink water from sewage. So there are two sets of pipes, two different colors. This is going to agriculture, this is going for drinking water. The second, so 90% of our water is reused. And if we do it in Israel, we can do it also in Africa. In fact, we can do it in Europe. The second country in the world is Spain, with less than 20%, I think 17 or 18% of the water is being reused. But if we do it in Israel, we can do it also in Kenya or Nigeria or Ghana, everywhere. It's not a secret, and it's not a holy thing. Now, on top of this problem of water and climate change, there is the problem of explosion of population. Now, in Nigeria today, there are more than 200, they say 220 million people, 220 million people. In the year 2050, which is less than 30 years, there will be 450 million people. 450 million people. The city of Lagos, that was yesterday 10 million people, will be 40 million people. How can you manage a city like this? How can you manage a country with 450 million people? That the desert from the north is going down, less and less water, and 450 million people. What do you think they will do? They will search, they will look for places that there is water and that the climate change, like Europe, they will start marching north. And the same with East Europe. In Tanzania, today, there are already about 50, 60 million people. In the year 2050, there will be 270 million people. Less water, climate change, desert is spreading around, they will go to Europe. Now, not only that, the problem is also wars in Africa. Already there are some estimates that there will be wars because of water in the year 2030, 8 years from now. Now, when there are wars and there are casualties and there is famine and all things, so all of us, all the Western world is throwing money, sending all kind of delegations to help Africa. But the thing is, let's help Africa now, today. We don't have to wait to 2050 or 2030. And this is what we, Galilee Institute, we have been doing it for 30 years already. We train, we educate. Really, the education is the key. We teach, for example, now in South Sudan, one of the poorest countries in the world. Can you imagine? More than 70%, listen, 70%, more than 70% of the women in South Sudan over the age of 30 do not know how to read and write, illiterate. What do we teach in South Sudan? Digital agriculture. We want to push this country upward, not to teach them how to water. Digital irrigation, digital agriculture. This is what we teach the youth. I'm glad that the World Bank is working with us and that we have this program in South Sudan. And we are trying to do the same thing in Western Africa, for Ghana. In fact, next week I will be in Ghana. The vice president of Ghana is responsible for digitalization of Ghana, and we are trying to push it. So let's do it, all of us together. Education, like Nelson Mandela. He said that we can change the world only through education. In fact, I remember Tony Blair, when he became, for the first time, Prime Minister of Britain, he said that he had 3 priorities, and he was there 10 years. First priority is education. Second priority is education. Third priority, education. Also in Israel, we were lucky that our first Prime Minister 70 years ago, he said that every child must go to school. And if the child is not going to school, the father is going to jail. Simple. And today, 74 years later, this was in 1948, we enjoy this decision, and Israel is very advanced. It's really a high-tech nation now, only because of education. So this is really the solution for Africa. We have to invest, all of us, in education. It doesn't matter what kind of education. Of course, agriculture or water management, but also civil engineering, everything. We have to invest in education, but this is the key. Unfortunately, some of the Western governments invest in all kinds of other things or other projects. But the main thing is agriculture, because we have to convince, we have to enable farmers to stay where they are, in their farms, and to cultivate their land even if they have less water, if they have less trees, if there is climate change. They will continue to cultivate their land, to stay where they are, and they should not. We have to convince them not to move to the cities, because if there is no water and they cannot cultivate, they move to the cities. They think they will find jobs, but there is no unemployment in those 40 million people in Lagos or 15 million people in Nairobi in the year 2050. So this is the way. This is what we are doing, and I hope that I convinced you that not only that we are doing a favor to Africa, but also Europe. Europe is going to suffer. It cannot be that Africans will be there with no water, no food, and they will not march. They will start marching to Europe. And we saw that there were only 3 million immigrants that came from Syria, the whole continent shook. And some governments even fell down, and not to mention the extreme governments that came up. So I want to conclude, there is a hope, there is a solution. We, especially we, the higher education, we cannot just sit and wait. We have to do something. So I hope I just added some points. Think about it, and we'll meet again. Thank you very much, and shalom from Israel. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much to Joseph, and I think that they gave us a very important view on what are the implications of the series of challenges that we are discussing today. So what could be the impact of global warming, lack of water, and but also highlighted that there is a solution, there is an hope, and this seeds in the transferring of best practice from countries to others, and in order to develop technology, digitalization, and more importantly, education. Now, since it's clear that climate change is playing an important role, I mean, in the future of and the evolution of the African European society. I think that let me introduce Simone Borg, that is the ambassador for climate action, and then of Department of Environmental Resource Law of University of Malta. I think that she can give us an important view on what is the implication of what are the implications of on the environment, and what can we do, I mean, in order to create a better future and stoke the fire of the hope in the next future. With a great honor, I give the floor to Simone Borg. Please, Simone.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and for asking me to participate. I have been listening with great interest to the speakers before me, and I think I will support what they have just said. My main focus will be, in fact, the importance that I see for Africa's future to decarbonize, to face climate change, but primarily to invest in its own resources, its natural resources, which are very abundant, and also to ensure that the African people enjoy this richness and become more and more in part of an environment that gives them not only a living, but a good quality of life. And I think this is something that one needs to really emphasize, that decarbonization should not be seen as a form of imposition by the North on the South, or because the people in the past have industrialized in the North and caused climate change as a problem. That is very true. But it is an opportunity for the countries of today, and particularly for the African continent, which will be very hard hit by climate change, to demand the right support, to build on the partnership, the strategic partnership that it has formed with Europe and many other European states, Malta being one of them, in order to be a continent that will decarbonize as soon as possible for its own benefit, and to invest particularly in its future, in its human resources. Because primarily dependency upon fossil fuels, dependency on importing energy from other countries, like any other country in the world, as we're seeing with what is happening in Europe, is always a drawback. So Africa, with its vast areas of land, with its innumerable potential for renewable energy, should be a leader in renewable energy generation, in the production of renewable energy manufacturing devices, because it offers a great opportunity for jobs for its people. But obviously, to do so, you have to have the right opportunities for the African nations to build capacity among their own people. And this is what Europe definitely is obligated to do, to invest in Africa, to support young African people, and ensure that whatever assistance is given to Africa in terms of monetary assistance, but also technological assistance, will be supported by learning, training, that the African people themselves can then run these new renewable energy devices, the kind of technology that will be fossil fuel free, the kind of technology that will bring about sustainability. I think that is very important. The capacity building is a very important fulcrum of a successful green transition. But it is also true to say, as the speakers before me have also emphasized, that Africa suffers from poverty, from misuse, abuse of its resources. In some countries, in some African countries, there are still abuses of every form, including abuses of the rule of law, abuses of human rights, abuses towards females, abuses towards people with disability or with the learning difficulties. And obviously there is also a discrepancy between the classes, the social classes. Definitely that a green transition, which is not just, which does not give an opportunity to all, which does not ensure that everybody has a chance to be participant in the green transition, cannot happen. Even in Europe, where roughly the economic standards of the different members of the European Union are more or less similar, one speaks of the need for a just transition to implement the European Green Deal. So definitely in every country, and particularly for the African continent, where we know the discrepancies, the different social, the social differences that exist, this is definitely something to keep in mind. So I think a partnership with Europe and with individual countries, like the one offered by Malta in its strategic partnership with Africa, needs to take into consideration the socio-economic realities, the geophysical realities, the culture. We are not speaking of any imposition of European culture upon Africa to decarbonize. Africa must find its own realities, its own ways. But the need to provide expertise, the exchange of experiences, even a mutual exchange, because there are, I am sure, African communities that have traditional knowledge that will be very important even for Europeans to learn from and to make the green transition in Africa a reality. We can learn from each other. Obviously, European countries have their own experiences. They have a lot of training and plans, policies, and strategies which they can share and help Africa to build upon. But we need to identify African countries' specific challenges that are particular to each state. We know that the different African countries are dealing with different aspects of climate change impacts. Many are suffering from drought. Many are suffering from desertification. Obviously, there would be also the other aspects like extreme events like flooding and storms. We are aware that sometimes it is easier to identify extreme weather events when they are sudden, but drought and desertification, which is very slow, is a challenge which many speakers before me have also mentioned, that is depriving Africa, that is causing displacement even within Africa. And whilst it is true that certain parts of Africa, like the Sahel, have had to deal with drought for many years, we are seeing that each time the situation is becoming more and more severe. So this is, after identifying these particular characteristics of the types of impacts of climate change, it is up to the European continent to support Africa in capacity building and training, and to ensure that Africa can adapt as much as possible to these changes. We must also keep in mind the current developments, post-COVID, the digitalized world. The speaker before me mentioned the importance of artificial intelligence in upgrading traditional methods like agriculture, but also all types of opportunities that digitalization can bring to Africa and to African youth. Better quality of life, sustaining a strong recovery, again, which leaves no one behind. Artificial intelligence is particularly important to identify discrepancies, distinction between the opportunities of categories of people. In identifying these risks and in identifying the different characteristics of various African states in meeting with climate adaptation, one can support African nations in building their resilience and competitiveness. And the first step to do that is to ensure their critical infrastructure, energy needs, water needs, support for literacy, which, as we've had, is astounding. The amount of people that still face literacy in Africa is tragic. We definitely have to understand that when we are looking at climate change, in itself, this is a threat, and it will make problems that have always afflicted Africa, like vector-borne diseases, as I mentioned, drought, persistent flooding, wars and conflicts on water. These will become worse, as will probably become worse migration because of displacement reasons. And so Europe itself has an interest, apart from a very strong obligation, to invest in Africa to prevent further damage. I think that one has to ensure that capacity building happens at all levels, starting from children in the elementary school. We can look at the importance of educating them in all the SDGs, because the SDGs have to be taken as a whole. What is the use of teaching decarbonization without addressing hunger, without addressing poverty, without addressing gender issues, without dealing with water and sanitation? So we have to look at African demands in their entirety. We cannot simply look at a problem and try to offer a solution which is just cosmetic. We need to understand where are the gaps in Africa's potential to progress, especially for their young people. So I think, in a way, we have to start from the very beginning of providing the necessary support to educate, to build awareness from the very early levels, but also throughout the lifetime of the African people. And this is where perhaps a lot of effort needs to be put for active aging in Africa. We talk a lot about it in Europe. Are we supporting African people to remain active as they age? Are we supporting in the same manner that you have lifelong learning, even for African people that had to work because of commitments towards family? All that we prize in Europe, if we really want to establish this partnership with Africa, needs to be transferred with our experience to the African nation. We know that the African people, for instance, hold family ties very dear. The sense of community is very important for them. The sense of family support. So this should make things easier. I do not wish to lengthen much further my intervention, because I know that there are other speakers who have many valuable things to say. But just to conclude, I think the most important things that we need to focus upon as Europeans in giving support to African people are helping them build a knowledge base, training them in capacity building, helping them in their critical infrastructure, ensuring the just transition, helping with building the skills gap and the maintenance of skills in situ, learning from past mistakes, even mistakes committed in Europe, and focusing on African solutions. I think this is a good way to conclude my intervention. I will need to leave you very soon. So if you don't mind, because I have to give a lecture, and if you don't mind, if there are any questions, I wonder if I can answer them immediately. Thank you very much, and well done for this opportunity, and wishing you well and auguring that this conference will lead much fruit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone. And now I believe that it's important to touch another angle that is around also the public health, with that of course has important implication for the future of Africa and Europe. For this, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Sonia Abdelhak, Principal Biologist at the Institut Pasteur of Tunisia, as Head of Research Unit on Orphan Genetic Disease. So please, Sonia, and thank you very much in advance for your contribution to this conference.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Melillo for inviting me to join. Several things have been already said, so allow me, first of all, to share with you some recommendations that have been established by an advisory group on research and innovation for Africa-Europe cooperation. So a set of recommendations have been established on how to make research and innovation a driver for sustainable development to enhance Africa-Europe relationships. So there were a set of independent expert groups in 4 priority areas. One on research and innovation capacities, another one on technology and innovation, a third one on green transition in Africa, and a 4th one on health, in which I had the pleasure to work with some colleagues, Professor Malin Temmerman, who had chaired our health group, Dr. Nelandaka, and Dr. Yusur Hamdi. So actually, I have to say that these recommendations are also useful for all the priority areas. So the first recommendation was about expanding and empowering research and innovation, in particular in the health sector, and empowering research and innovation networks. And this has to be set and based on equity and agendas driven by local, national, and regional needs. It has been already said by others, the issue of co-creation and the importance of co-creation, not only at the implementation level, but also at the design phase and in this programming of the collaborative agendas. The second recommendation was about encouraging the creation of collaborations based on former success stories. For instance, for example, for the health sector, there was this EDCTP. It's about increasing the capacities in Africa for clinical trials and to allowing researchers in the health sector to be able to contribute in really contributing actively in clinical trials with priorities relevant to health in Africa. There is also a need for some accompanying measures. And here I come to the third recommendation. It's about strengthening and promoting collaboration of national ethical committees and national regulatory authorities. There is a need to reinforce ethics and regulatory issues related to health systems and related to health products. And actually, this is not valuable not only for the health sector. Aligning regulations and strengthening the ethics is of utmost importance, in particular in the era of big data and in the era of artificial intelligence. Actually, the fourth recommendation is about strengthening institutions and mechanisms to allow interactions as the one we are seeing in this conference between research policymakers and various stakeholders and researchers who can influence the uptake of research findings and invest in knowledge synthesis and translation. In this way, the policymakers may use research evidence to justify decisions, and in turn, also research findings may also gradually spread themselves into the language and concepts used by policymakers and in policymaking. And the fifth recommendation, actually, when I heard Professor Karim Moustaghfir, he has showed a wide range of initiatives between Europe and Africa. And actually, there is a need of a high-level coordination on all these initiatives. Somehow, we need to have some monitoring, evaluation, and impact assessment of all what is going on between both continents. So for that, we really need a safe space of truth, trustful, transparent exchange. I don't mean to be rude, but since the beginning of this conference, I was wondering, where is Africa? Where are Africans? And hearing about solidarity or assistance and hearing about increasing solidarity, is it in one way, north to south? It has been already said by Professor Borg that there are also lessons to take from African colleagues. Actually, I personally, I have benefited from African and European cooperation. If I'm here today in my institute doing what I'm doing, it's thanks to the international cooperation activities. It's thanks to mobility programs that have been set by Europe in the continent. So I'm really very grateful for that. In the same time, sometimes there is this cognitive dissonance between what is said and what is done. So we need really to be more aligned to our values to maintain this sustainable cooperation. And I would be really very happy to continue this discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And now also to have the view of the entrepreneurial and enterprise environment, and since one of the objectives, as we are doing, of this panel is to understand how all the stakeholders can dialogue and cooperate in order to identify policies and solution. I will give the floor to Francesca Brigandi, that is the President of Italian Association for Chambers of Commerce, Mediterranean and the Gulf country in Italy. So, Mrs. Brigandi, thank you very much in advance for your contribution, and please.
Buongiorno, innanzitutto un ringraziamento alla professoressa Luigia Melillo, rettore della Pegaso International, per l'invito. L'argomento oggetto del mio intervento è molto stimolante e impegnativo per le attuali sfide che stiamo vivendo. L'Unione Europea è il primo partner commerciale dei paesi del sud del Mediterraneo e ne rappresenta sia il primo mercato d'esportazione che di importazione. Il partenariato euro-mediterraneo riunisce gli Stati membri dell'Unione e 11 paesi del Mediterraneo: Algeria, Egitto, Giordania, Libano, Libia, Marocco, Siria, Tunisia, Turchia e territori occupati di Palestina. Nonostante i progressi disuguali registrati nello sviluppo della politica imprenditoriale, Anche le imprese dell'UE hanno già beneficiato della cooperazione industriale euro-mediterranea. La conoscenza reciproca ha creato fiducia e ciò ha permesso di sviluppare progetti comuni in ambiti come l'istruzione, le qualifiche, la costituzione di cluster e l'innovazione. Tra le cose positive, in seguito ai processi di transizione in certi paesi, le organizzazioni del settore privato sono diventate più attive. Sono state costituite nuove associazioni, alcune delle quali rappresentano i nuovi imprenditori, e si sono esaminate le relazioni consolidate tra le elite politiche e quelle imprenditoriali. Nella regione il dialogo pubblico-privato è più aperto e costruttivo e ha contribuito in generale a migliorare la qualità delle politiche pubbliche nei riguardi delle piccole imprese. Per le economie del Mediterraneo, soprattutto per quelle in via di transizione sul piano politico, la sfida consiste nello sviluppare e attuare politiche strutturali in tempi difficili in cui occorrono soluzioni a breve termine. Non siamo abituati a ragionare nel medio-lungo termine, facciamo fatica a distinguere un costo da un investimento, non ci poniamo il problema del dopo, del futuro conseguente. La crisi ha acuito la nostra propensione al qui e ora. In sintesi, il percorso da esperire potrebbe essere il seguente. Definiamo gli interventi standard in considerazione di settori, di paesi, aree e di eventi. Facciamo un'accurata mappatura del territorio in termini di eccellenze da valorizzare. Definiamo i progetti specifici dedicati in una pianificazione che tenga conto dei rapporti tra i diversi soggetti sul territorio, camere di commercio, regioni, eccetera. Progettiamo le singole iniziative, stabilendo budget e attività in base alla metodologia di project management. Per potenziare e dare un servizio in linea con le esigenze del tempo presente, l'organizzazione che ho l'onore di presiedere ha costituito una società di servizi che si chiama Comedit Consulting, che ha progettato una piattaforma digitale in grado di raggiungere privati e istituzioni. Allo stato sono in atto degli ulteriori approfondimenti e modifiche e saremo operativi dal prossimo novembre. A questo punto ritengo che sia necessario il lavoro e l'impegno di tutti perché l'inclusività non sia solo una dichiarazione di intenti. Buon lavoro a tutti e cordialità vivissime.
Well, thank you very much to Mrs. Brigandi, and I think that now we can give the space to questions or further comments after all this important speech that we received from our keynote speakers and all the other distinguished contributors. If there are there any questions, we are more than open to address this. Maybe Jacqueline Michalef, do you have any questions? You are on mute. Jacqueline, you're on mute.
Okay, is that fine?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to ask a question if possible. Well, I have a number of questions actually. It's been highly challenging and motivating. All the contributions were very interesting. My area is education, and I would like to particularly ask the panel, in their learned opinion, what the state of preparedness of the African people and the government to embrace distance and online learning is. Is the infrastructure in place to enable distance and online learning? Is the government, the Ministry of Education, for example, ready to sponsor its people's education? And many of the panelists mentioned Nelson Mandela. So in the spirit of Nelson Mandela, how can educational institutions, for example, like Pegaso International, be instrumental in furthering education in Africa through online learning? Quite a number of questions there, but I can post it in the chat if you like. Thank you.
Karim, I don't know if you want to address this question, otherwise.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much for this very interesting question, Jacqueline. Yeah, definitely. Again, I think that it was mentioned by Professor El-Zoheiry that maybe we should not also put all the African countries in the same basket. We have high income, we have middle, let's say upper middle income or lower middle income, but we have also low income countries.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And within the same countries, we find also, I think that I already mentioned it, inequalities. And it was also mentioned by President Marie-Louise.
Mm-hmm.
So again, within the same countries, we may find also different realities. It's not only, let's say, a matter of bringing just the same solution for all, or thinking about, let's say, the same perspective for all, or just adopting something like, okay, the same size would fit all. Okay, so I can give you some experiences here. First of all, besides what was mentioned regarding the fast growing economies in Africa, that was anyway. So this is a trend that was dramatically affected by COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
And this was also the trend with regards to the mobile subscriptions. We had really the highest rate in terms of mobile subscriptions in Africa among all continents. So just to give you an idea that, yes, there is tendency also to adopt technology, but at the same time, there are challenges. First challenge, yes, in terms of telecommunication infrastructure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there are initiatives also to give devices. For instance, when given devices to people, it doesn't mean that they can really access information, because that would require telecommunication infrastructure, internet, but more than that, content. So online education, yes, there are so many attempts. And by the way, I had the chance actually to see at least 3 different initiatives in Africa. And it was quite amazing to see how universities in Africa are well aware of the challenges of the 21st century job market, but also learning. So when talking about learning, so yes, a number of universities, particularly emerging universities, and this is also another trend. Yes, definitely that may contribute also to additional disparities and inequalities, but it's there, right? It exists. We have a number of innovative universities growing. And such universities are adopting, experimenting with pedagogical innovation. They care and they put it as their priority, student success and employability. They have also, I would not say 100% online learning, but some kind of hybrid learning. They experiment with learning strategies like flipped learning, so developing the content, giving access also to that content, and then using the classroom as an environment for discussion and knowledge sharing and so on and so on. So again, there are experiences, but at the same time, we cannot generalize it. Why? Because of all the challenges I already mentioned. So economic challenges, social challenges, among other things. And the level I mentioned actually also the learning, but also it's a question of content. Having the infrastructure, having devices is not enough. We should also care about developing also the right content. And here I think that there is room for cooperation between Europe and Africa. When it comes to having content that is clearly adapted to the context of Africa. A number of speakers have been talking about challenges like water, like deforestation and desertification and energy, right? And food and so on and so on. I think that there is room to contextualize also the content of education to deal with African realities. And this is in line with also what a number of speakers have been mentioning. I think it's time for Europe because there are definitely other interests. Professor El-Zoheiry mentioned Russia and China, but we should not forget about US. So the US anyway, so is considering Africa as really one of the promising, let's say, realities for growth and also development in the future. And with all the free zones that they are developing now with a number of African countries, right? For trade, but at the same time also for cooperation and so on. So I think for Europe, and I think that all of us have been working collaboratively with a number of European countries, but unfortunately, we don't see the same tendency. I think it's time so that we move from this perspective where we just talk about Africa
exactly.
to talking to Africa and talking with Africa.
With Africa, yes.
And I think that there is a need actually so to work also with Africa. So I think that this is so just trying also to export tailored services, including education, will not work, right? I think that it has been proven that it presents a lot of limitations. So again, these are just a few thoughts in reaction also of your question, but anyway, so if there is time, we can elaborate more on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karim. And I think that if I may also would be exactly, Hamid, I was just giving the floor to you to, please.
Sorry, I don't know if you wanted to interfere. I'm sorry, I thought you didn't see my hand. But if you want to interfere, go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just giving the floor to you, just to give the perspective of the African policymaker in this space. So you anticipated me. Please.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, now I will talk as a president of a university in Europe, and we're also preparing some programs now for Africa. So actually, Jacqueline's question is right. Let's say to the point. First, I have to say that I think it is very obvious from the interactions and the discussions in this panel that Africa is a continent of discrepancies. Discrepancies in socioeconomic standards, discrepancies in levels of education, discrepancies in wealth, and as Karim very rightfully said, we cannot put all Africa in one package. This is impossible. I'll give you, for instance, first I'll answer your question about the preparedness for the infrastructure. I really, and when it comes to online learning, the last of our concerns should be the infrastructure, because everyone has a mobile phone, and many of the countries have 4G. So yes, there will be some challenges in some areas. I'm not saying no. Again, discrepancies, but I don't think the infrastructure will pose a problem, especially now with Elon Musk's Starlink, for instance. You can mobilize internet in a matter of if there is a will, there will be a way. So it's really not the infrastructure, it's the content. And it is the preparedness of the human resources to adapt to the content. And this is even another bigger challenge. And this is if this is a challenge in Europe, you can imagine it is also a bigger challenge in Africa. But having said this, again, to show you just some of the discrepancies, I visited 2 institutions in Africa. One in Stellenbosch, University of Stellenbosch, which is just very close to Cape Town in South Africa. And there they have a level of education which is higher than many of universities in Europe. And they have a sustainability center, which is one of the, let's say, really something that, as has been said before, maybe it is a model that in Europe we can learn from. And if we are saying maybe South Africa, we know that South Africa is more developed than the rest of Africa. All right, let's give you another example from somewhere you won't imagine. Is I visited also the medical school of the Gezira University in Sudan. And Sudan is one of the poor nations in Africa. And the students in the medical school, they are sitting on very poor furniture, but they are learning by problem-based learning. Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to again, highlight the value of the content. And the content here cannot be just created in Europe or the US and sent to Africa. It has to be co-created. Sonia has been talking about this, the co-creation, the co-ownership, the co-decision-making, and creating content which is, let's say, suitable for Africa and according to the African priorities and needs. And I hope this answers your question. So let's not focus on just in short, again, to recap, infrastructure is not the issue. The issue is preparedness of human resources, which again is also a challenge in Europe, and developing the appropriate content which is relevant to the African needs. So I think these are the 2 issues in education.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I do not see any further questions in the chat. Please feel free, I mean, to raise hand in case you have questions or to. Okay. So if there aren't any other question or contribution, I like to conclude this panel. I mean, first of all, with a great thanks to all the contributors and to all the participants. I think that we covered all the questions with a very in depth and breadth. I was honestly really impressed by the different angles that we touched during this panel. And now I think as Pegaso International, we will do a report to highlight all the results and outcome of this panel. Also cooperating with all the participants and sharing this with all the participants, and in particular, I mean, jointly with EMUNI, that among the others gave us a great contribution. And we also like to highlight that as Pegaso International, given I mean, the place given our location, this connection between Europe and Africa is extremely important for us. And we will, the objective of this report will be, I mean, to put in a paper all the major outcome that we discussed together in order to divulgate this and try to give our contribution to policymakers and increasing dialogue and between Africa and Europe. Having said that, I again thank you all, and I give you back this 15 minutes, and I wish you again, a great work for the next panel and session of these important events. Thank you very much to all, and goodbye.
Thank you all. Thank you, Director Buonomo. And for the PhD students, we will meet again at 18:15 for the workshop on the importance of research methodology in the PhD studies. See you soon. Thank you, everyone. Rector Melillo thanks you all, and she will write for you directly. Thanks. Good afternoon.